What's up, guys? Zanbono here, and this past Saturday I watched UFC 203. And if you aren't familiar with that UFC card, it was the card where CM Punk fought Mickey Gall. And this fight was, I think, pretty important for the sport of UFC as a whole. And before we get to that and why I think that the fight was important and the significance of the fight and I think we can learn from it and take away, let's recap what happened in the fight if you didn't get a chance to see it. So basically, CM Punk, for those of you who don't know, and I'm sure you all do at this point, CM Punk is a former WWE champion who decided to retire from the WWE to try and pursue a dream of being a UFC fighter. So what happened in this fight was basically CM Punk walked out to the middle of the octagon pretty aggressively to try and meet Gall there. He threw one really big punch, Gall ducked it, and took him down immediately. And once they got down to the ground, CM Punk was pretty much helpless. Right away, Punk tried to throw a couple little side shots to the head. Didn't really affect him. He ended up getting 0 significant strikes counted, and Gall ended up throwing 20 significant strikes. Gall pretty much beat his head in. I think a little piece of CM Punk's ear was missing at the top, and he had it all bandaged up after the end of the fight. He took some pretty clean shots to the head, some pretty powerful shots that were beating him up, and then Gall took it from behind and got a rear naked choke for the victory about 2 minutes and 15 seconds into the fight. So it was pretty decisive. CM Punk didn't do anything at all in the fight, and Mickey Gall dominated from the start right away. I think what this fight really shows is the difference in talent between the average person and a trained fighter. So if for any reason you're not a UFC fan or you just thought maybe they were just throwing fighters out there and it was like a circus show, if you've never watched the UFC and you don't quite understand it, these are very, very high-skilled, trained athletes. Just like the NFL, just like the NBA, just like Major League Baseball. And I understand that fighting is a lot more controversial than hitting a ball with a stick or putting a ball in a hoop. The NFL is pretty controversial, but you can definitely tell the level of skill difference is significant. So let's imagine it's the Olympics, okay? And you watch Usain Bolt run. You can see his time and what he runs a 100-meter dash. So let's say he runs the 100-meter dash in 9.69 seconds. That's blazing fast. You can go outside, measure 100 meters, and then go run it yourself, and you'll have an idea of how fast you are compared to the fastest man in the world. You can't really do that with a UFC fighter. You can't just figure out, how good of a fighter am I? I can't just go fight some random guy in the street, beat him up, and then say, I could beat someone up in the UFC, because that guy might not be a highly skilled trained fighter like Mickey Gall was. CM Punk is a white belt with a stripe in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Mickey Gall is a brown belt. So Mickey Gall has been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for about 8 years. CM Punk has been doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu for 2 years. And when you take a guy who is that much more trained than you, it's now obvious the level of difference in skill of how badly he can beat you on the ground and how you're pretty much helpless. Now, Punk did defend a couple of submission attempts very early, but it's still within 2 minutes and 15 seconds, he was just dominated and beat to a pulp and then submitted. So it was never really a fair fight from the start. The thing about this fight for Punk is he's an above-average athlete. He's more athletic than probably you or I. He trained for 2 years for this fight, and he fought maybe the easiest fight he could have possibly had in the UFC and was still just destroyed. So, because Mickey Gall, it's not like he's been doing this for 20 years. I mean, yeah, he's been training for 8 years in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Yes, he has a brown belt, and he's 3-0. But he hasn't fought anybody that's really worthy or worth note. It's one thing if Punk were to go and fight someone who's at the top, a ranked fighter, a guy in the top 10, I couldn't even imagine how badly that fight could have gone compared to how bad it did go. So when you look at it as a whole, you take a guy who's an above-average athlete, was able to train for a few years for a fight, and then fought one of the weakest when it comes to age, experience, skill level, record, one of the weakest guys on the UFC roster, he was just obliterated. So it's important for the sport, so now they can have some legitimacy. I mean, they should have already. This is just for people who aren't fans of the sport. There's some legitimacy to the claim of how hard it is to do what these guys do. Now you have an idea of when you see Usain Bolt run that speed of 9.69, and you want to go time yourself to see how different it is. We now have an idea of how different it is than if I were to try and fight a guy like Mickey Gall, or if you see Conor McGregor, how different it would be if I tried to fight Conor McGregor. You now have an idea of how significantly different their skill set is from my skill set, and why you should be careful if you ever try to fight somebody in the street, because you never know what their level of training is and how much better they could be at what they're doing than you. Also, I think this is going to be able to open up a new fan base for the UFC. A lot of WWE fans, I'm sure, probably tuned in. They made, I'd assume the sales numbers were much higher because of CM Punk on the card. People that typically wouldn't buy a UFC card did. Maybe they were drawn into the sport. Maybe, I don't know if it was the strongest card in the world, but maybe want to sell people on their sport. I think CM Punk fighting at 203 against Mickey Gall was a better thing for the sport than it was a bad thing. CM Punk learned that he needs to go down and try and fight somebody at a different level below the UFC, because like I said, it doesn't really get any easier than the Mickey Gall fight that you had. Nothing against Mickey Gall. He looked really good in that fight, and I'm excited to watch him fight again, and I think his fight, if he gets the fight against Sage Northcutt, could be extraordinary. I think it could be a really good fight between two guys who are both on Dana White's series looking for a fight. I would love to see them fight. I think whoever wins that fight would just, their popularity would increase way more than it already is, and both of those guys are two really young guys on UFC rosters that are headed in the right direction. So that'd be a really interesting fight to see who could get their career propelled to the next level. So that's pretty much it. I just think that I think the fight as a whole was good for the UFC, because now we have an idea of what a somewhat more average person would look like in a fight against a skilled, trained fighter, and it just it gives a level of legitimacy to the sport of UFC, to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Not that it needed any more to start with, because if you know anything about the sport or about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu already, you should understand that there's a legitimate claim for how tough it is to do what these guys do. But for the average fan or the uneducated fan, I think this was a really good measuring stick. So if you guys enjoyed the video, please hit like. Feel free to subscribe, and I'll be back with a couple videos this week. Should be a busy week uploading, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching.